That's great.
As many of you already know, Napa Valley Community Foundation works side by side with local donors and nonprofits to tackle the most important challenges our valley faces. We believe that a prosperous community rises from a strong foundation. So every day we gather generous hearts and bright minds to solve the problems that lie just beneath the surface of this beautiful place we all call home. Because when we're able to harness the power of our collective generosity, we become a force for good, making life better for everybody in the valley. With help from many of you in this room, I'm proud to tell you that in our 30-year history, we've distributed more than $110 million in grants and scholarships. And right now, we're keenly focused on two things. We do a lot, but right now, forefront for us is doubling our financial commitment each year for immigrant legal services in this community. And two is launching a new safety net fund, which we did, remember the housing bust as fondly as I do? So these are tough times for our core social services organizations who've already lost state of California funding and methinks might lose some federal funding too. So you'll be hearing more from us about those two things. Briefly, with respect to the first, we've played offense for more than a decade with respect to immigration. We have built and funded a legal services infrastructure that's helped more than 2,600 of our neighbors become U.S. citizens. It's helped hundreds of people obtain or renew their DACA and renew the odd green card holder's green card. Those assets can also play defense within the four corners of the law to ensure people have due process, that they know their rights, that we're all educated about what is real and what is not, because the climate of fear is palpable already, and we're doing everything that we can to work in the opposite direction of that with accurate information and services. So other than writing checks, which is really the only reason people return my phone calls, one of our pieces of our mission is to try to build a stronger sense of community. And one way that we do that is by bringing all of us together for these sort of open public forums where we bring folks to talk respectfully and cordially about things that matter to our community and in other places too. Always in an even-handed, nonpartisan way, always with the help of an outside expert or two that we import to Napa, like our special guest tonight, John Rahaim. So today we're here to talk about the general planning process in the state of California. How it works, what are the required elements that must be there, why is it important? I think you need no convincing about that, and how everyday people can get involved. I am grateful that some of our Napa County electeds and policy implementers are with us in the room, but I want to make it clear that this is not a county-sponsored event. Independent of our friends at the county, the foundation is keenly interested in this topic because really this is, it's sort of like brood 17 of the cicada. Every 20 years or so, this thing opens up, and it's a chance for all of us to get engaged, to think about what is the roadmap, what is the compass, where do we want to be in the year 2045 or whatever. And speaking of decades, I have been in Napa for exactly 21 years as of this week. I started my job on February 4th, a Monday, in 2004. And to say that Napa County, Napa City, Napa Valley has changed profoundly in that time would be an understatement. In fact, it would be like an insult to the word understatement to call it an understatement. It's just been staggering to see how much has changed. And really, ultimately, the foundation's role is to try to use your moral and financial support to draw attention to challenges and problems and to try to address those problems as best we can. So, herewith, in no particular order, are some of the challenges that I, as an almost local, not quite, after 21 years, have seen emerge or worsen since the last time the county's general plan was updated in 2008. They include the appalling scarcity of housing for our workforce, the way housing and transportation intersect with each other and with climate change, the increased frequency and intensity of wildfires in our landscape, see above reference to climate change, the relationship between federal immigration policy that we do not control and the vitality of our economy and the dignity of our neighbors and our workforce and ag and hospitality at a local level, the urgent task of finding a balanced approach to growth, an approach that enables the twin engines of this economy, ag and hospitality, to flourish while also protecting watersheds, ecosystems, and our climate. And finally, inviting to the table the voices of people who might not be able to turn up at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday for a Board of Soups meeting. So it's quite a list, yes? And that's not even the whole enchilada, okay? I could go on, but I won't, because you don't want me to. So lucky me, I'm not the person who has to sort of talk about the planning process in general. That is the job of our wonderful speaker, John Rahaim. So like they say on those TV insurance ads, like John knows a thing or two because he's seen a thing or two. He is a city planner and urban designer. He is currently an adjunct professor at Cal, teaching a master's course on real estate and design, and he's had similar academic posts at both Carnegie Mellon and Harvard. Most recently, he was the planning director of the City County of San Francisco between 2008 and 2020, pardon me, a time of explosive growth for the city. Prior to that, he had similar jobs in places like Seattle and Pittsburgh. And just in case you were worried that John would turn up here in Napa and take it all in like Ava Gabor did in Green Acres, like here's an urban fellow who's come to our bucolic splendor of this valley. Don't worry, he's been here before. He still has a place in the city, and we had a chance to talk about some of the contextual issues about this community before he graciously accepted my invitation to come. So without further ado, would you extend a warm welcome to John?
Very strange arrangement where preservation was separate from the planning department, which didn't work at all, in my opinion. And then so for my first 5 or 6 years in working, and this is true of many of my colleagues, these 4 functions were primarily how I focused my time, how I spent my time. And then things really changed. We got more involved in urban design and kind of design of streets and open spaces and how everything works together, right? Environmental sustainability. That wasn't even a thing when I started my planning career at 35 years. Nobody knew what that meant. Nobody was thinking of, I mean, people were thinking about the issues, but it wasn't an integral part of how I did my work, right? Data has become a huge part of what planning agencies do. And in fact, one of the ways you'll have to update your general plan is to gather a lot of data in the first phase of the project. The state requires that. You're going to want it to understand where you are, kind of a point in time of the conditions of your county. Transportation planning has become a much more important part of what we do as planners, far more, and we finally understand the very important connection between land use and transportation, which we did not understand years ago, and how important it is to think about those two things together. Climate change and sea level rise, who knew? I mean, in San Francisco, the Mayor Lee asked me to help with the port start thinking about sea level rise on the city's perimeter, right? I mean, every county in the Bay Area is going to have to deal with this issue in some way, and it's real, and it's happening daily. If you walk, and I'm sure this is happening in other parts of the Bay Area, but if you walk down the Embarcadero in San Francisco during a king tide, your feet will get wet now. That was not happening 20 years ago. And finally, the whole issue of community planning and equity planning is something that we have been spending, and a lot of planners are now spending more time with, thinking about these issues, about the very issues that I mentioned earlier, the social cohesion of our neighborhood, dealing with things like evictions and the challenges of homelessness and housing costs and so on. So what's interesting about this to me is that how the world that we sort of occupied as planners, which was a fairly narrow world, has grown and become much more complex and much more layered, if you will. But what all this is interesting, and it's basically a list of tasks. And what many of us in the day-to-day world that we occupy as planners, as elected officials, or some of whom are in the room, and as others, is just, it doesn't allow us to take a step back and say, what are we doing all this for? Why are we thinking about these issues? What are we striving for in the future? And that's kind of what a general plan is. And there's a kind of beauty in us, in forcing us actually to think about that every few years, like Terrence said, to think about what is it we really want to be in the future? What kind of place do we want to be? So that's a question that a general plan allows you to ask. Now, to be fair, you have a great general plan right now. I mean, since Terrence invited me to do this, I've been looking over parts of it, and it's really a great piece of work. So you're updating it. You're not creating this thing from whole cloth. But obviously, things need to change. and you need to think about the future, and you need to think about how the demographics have changed, the data that I talked about, how is it affecting your plan as you move forward. So do you want to be, obviously what you want to be is not what San Francisco wants to be, or Oakland or Fremont. It's a very different environment, and that's all to the good. But do we want to be a low-density environment? Do we want to be pedestrian-oriented? Do you want to be car-oriented? Do you want to be more income diverse? Do you want more housing? These are all questions you should ask yourselves, right, as you move forward. All these things can coexist to a certain extent, but it's important, I think, to just ask the basic questions again, and if necessary, reiterate the goals that you set in your previous general plan. Some people would roll their eyes and say, we don't have time for this. It's just namby-pamby, high-level stuff. And I would argue again that it's important to think about these things because, in fact, it does have an effect on the character of your city, of your county, on the economic future of your county. And in the long run, for your children and grandchildren, I think is really where these decisions really come home. And I will say, I think you in Napa have done a much better job than most counties in the Bay Area of really thinking about this issue. I mean, your agricultural preserve is astonishing. It really is. And I mean, you are to be applauded for this. There's very few places that could accomplish this. And I think what you've done here is a pretty special thing. So what's in a general plan? The state, so just to get into the weeds just a bit, and we can get into more of this as you move forward in the Q&A. The state requires 9 what are called elements of a general plan, and these are the 9. They're called elements. I don't know why. I don't know why they're not called topics or plans, and in fact, this creates some confusion. You know, there was so much discussion the last few years about the housing element. And if you read the San Francisco Chronicle, it often uses the phrase, the so-called housing element. It's like, why is that? They never tell you that it's an element of the general plan, of course, but that's where the name comes from. I've highlighted the housing element because it has taken on a life of its own because of state law, right? So you have a housing element that was adopted, I believe, in 2023 that accomplishes the state's goals and state requirements. And while the housing elements live in a county's general plan, they have this sort of special life of their own and have special requirements and their own schedule and so on. One of the interesting things about the housing element that didn't used to exist is that it has to specifically identify locations where housing growth will happen. And it has to, to accommodate the growth that the state has allocated for each county in the state. So the housing element is an important document that way, and being much clearer than I think parts of the rest of the general plan about how the city can grow and how a county can grow in terms of housing. The other element that's starting to have this same importance is the safety element in response to natural disasters, wildfires, flooding, and so on. So the state has also issued separate and sort of more specific guidelines of how your county how all counties should and can do their safety elements. So I just wanted to highlight just one example to give you a sense of how detailed the state expects each county to be. The circulation element, which most counties call a transportation plan, and they note here, is not simply a transportation plan, but a strategy, and look at this list, addressing needs for the circulation of people, goods, energy, water, sewage, storm drainage, and communications. It's a pretty long list. So it's not just about how we drive around or walk around or bike around, it's basically about our full panoply of infrastructure. And that has to be addressed at some level in the general plan. And this is the list of things that have to be included. So it's a lot of stuff. And you can see in places like San Francisco or Oakland or San Jose, this becomes incredibly complicated, right? I mean, I think San Francisco is on the 4th year of doing just the transportation element right now. Because of that, and this is you have an advantage over the larger cities, I believe, in this process because San Francisco has never, in recent history to my knowledge, looked at the entire general plan because of the complexity of it, because of these issues, because doing each element can take 3 or 4 years, right? And that's a real problem because we in fact didn't have the opportunity to see how these things interact, how they're interconnected. You have that opportunity, and I think it's super important to take advantage of that, right? And it's my understanding that the intent here is to actually look at it holistically and update the entire plan at the same time. I think that's really important. I would really encourage you to kind of stick with that approach. In addition, what's interesting is the state gives each county and city the option of adding your own elements. And you have chosen in your current plan to add these two, which I think is great. Community character, economic development, that seems obvious. It's not actually required by the state, and many communities don't do it. The economic development is the one that I find interesting and wonderful. I think it's great that it's an integral part of your thinking about your planning for your future, and not some separate document that is only under the purview of an economic development agency or someone else. There is an integral relationship, which I think is super important with how you move forward. So how is a general plan used? How is it implemented? Here's a few ways. Zoning is the obvious one, right? When you rezone a piece of land, if you say a piece of land is now agricultural and is now to be allowed for something else, which I'm sure you won't do, you have to say that that decision is consistent with the general plan, that the general plan allows for that, right? Zoning is the most obvious, but there's a few others. The building codes, obviously, the acquisition of properties by the county, by cities, capital projects, infrastructure projects. And there's this thing that I'll talk about in a minute about these findings of consistency that has to happen, so that when a public agency is making a decision that affects a piece of land, there has to be a finding that that decision is consistent with the general plan. So I would sign a couple of letters a week to various departments in San Francisco saying, yes, this decision in this roadway or this sewer line is consistent with the general plan. What you've done here is actually taken this a step further, and I really like this, is why I've highlighted that last line, is Napa County has this implementation action item on a list that lists all of the action items called for in your general plan and has a status report on each of them. So it's kind of a roadmap for the county on how to proceed with implementing the plan. And that's very helpful, and frankly, very few counties do this, and I think it's really, really terrific that you do. So there's some challenges, obviously. Let me just go through some of these as I've seen them. Terrence, how's my time? You still pretty good? Maybe 5 more minutes. I forgot to turn my...
Yeah, you're perfect. 5 more minutes.
Excuse me. There are several challenges that I've experienced when we were doing pieces of the general plan. One is that there's this tension between trying to keep it high level and aspirational and wanting to write code. And you know, there are forces that push you in both directions, right? The idea of a general plan historically has been that it's general. It's not specific. But over the years, because of things that have happened, like with the housing element and other aspects of state law, there have been requirements and frankly public pressure from you all, from elected officials, from the business community to be more and more specific about what you want, right? So these conflicts are very inherent in the process. It's one of the things you'll discover as you move forward with the planning process. It's especially true of the housing and safety elements, which are by law required to be more specific now. On the one hand, when you think about it, if you keep it high level, it won't take as long and you'll get more kind of community consensus. But it might be so high level that it's meaningless, right? And that's the tension. So if you do a more detailed plan, it'll take more time, and has the potential of more conflict and internal kind of issues. But that's the tension that you have to kind of balance when you work on this. Secondly, there are often conflicts within the plan itself. And that's simply because that issues overlap. Because of the overlap of the issues, land use or transportation or the recreation and plan component, all of these things have overlapping kind of jurisdiction, if you will, and sometimes they come into conflict. One example, San Francisco was, several years ago when I got here, was doing an update of doing a library expansion plan, doing new libraries, expanded libraries. And many of these libraries, well, I shouldn't say many, maybe 3 or 4 are in city parks. The parks and recreation element of the city's general plan says building footprints should not be expanded. It's parkland. You shouldn't be building on parkland. San Francisco has something called the community facilities element that says we should support parks, we should support libraries and allow them to grow. Those things are obviously in conflict. We had to work that out. We had to figure out how we could honor the intent of the general plan and of both components of the general plan. And obviously we wanted our libraries to be updated, so that's the process we went through. We also, thirdly, must find these consistency findings are really, really interesting and important. You have to find that major decisions on land use, new public buildings, roadways, whatever it might be, are consistent. Another example I'll give you was also related to parks. There was a proposal several years ago by the community to create a new park in a part of San Francisco that was already very well served by parks, very close to Golden Gate Park, other parks. And our general plan had a kind of radius around existing parks that basically said, if there's a park within, I don't remember the number, a quarter mile or something, we shouldn't be building new parks within that same radius. We should put them in places that don't have parks today. And there are several neighborhoods, in fact, growing neighborhoods in San Francisco that are really deficient in terms of parkland. But this particular community, there was a piece of city-owned land that they really wanted a park. And they had raised money for someone to build or to maintain this park. And that was the challenge that we came up with. And not only, for me, it was not just an issue of whether it was consistent with the plan, but also the issue of spending scarce capital dollars in a location that didn't need them as much as another part of the city needed them. And I fought that battle for 2 years, and I lost. The park is there, it was built. To be fair, the community raised the money for a long-term maintenance fund of this park, which is great. But the actual capital dollars to build this park actually did come out of the Parks Fund that could have been used to build parks in other parts of the city, and was not. These are the issues that come up when you go through this process. And finally, there's this issue of how the plan is actually used. Ideally, it is supposed to guide land use decisions, right? It's supposed to guide not only zoning, but other decisions that public agencies make and how you move forward. And this is, again, going back to your current general plan, the usefulness of that implementation action item list, right? It's a very useful way of keeping the plan current, keeping it in front of people, and moving forward in that direction. Finally, I just want to kind of compliment you. Just some personal thoughts when I looked through your document. The obvious overriding theme of your plan, as it should be, and I think is generally embraced here, is that this is basically an agricultural preserve with a few towns, right? And if you look at this map, obviously Napa has far more greenery than any other county in the Bay Area, which is by design. I think that's incredible. I mean, you guys, I applaud you for actually being able to stick with this over the years, right? It's a pretty special thing. But there's a second reason that I really admire you for this, which is how important it is to the entire region. Right? Your preservation of agricultural land and Marin's preservation of a lot of its green space is really an asset to the entire region. And not only that, it's a great example, right? It's a great example of preserving land, whether for agriculture or other types of open space, and concentrating development in our cities in places that make sense. So I think those are both kind of laudable policies in your current plan. And finally, I just thought it was interesting that your planning department, what most of us call planning departments, the name of your department actually starts with the word conservation, which is great. I mean, it's a real indication of what your values are and what your policies are in this county. So with that, that was kind of a high-level overview. I didn't want to bore you with the details, but I'm happy to answer any questions and have a conversation as we move forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Okay. Is this on?
So the city of Napa recently did update its general plan and included two elements that I'd like you to comment on. One was for climate change and sustainability, and the other was for public health and all policies.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also wanted to ask you, because one of the overriding issues in the county is about groundwater use.
Mm-hmm.
You've seen that in
To answer the second question first, I don't know. That's an issue that is actually dealt with in a lot of codes, but I'm not sure if a general plan in and of itself, certainly there isn't any reason why it couldn't, right? And the sustainability question is is a interesting one. We struggle, I know that other communities have struggled with this too, whether sustainability should be its own component of the general plan, or whether it should kind of cut across all of the components, right? Because all of the other issues that we talked about also have components that address sustainability in some fashion. So in some ways, it might be good. It might be best to think about it both ways, right? You have an element of a plan that is really kind of very strong about policies and the goals to be a sustainable community, but then you also make sure that those are spread through other elements of the plan as well. Does that answer your question? Oh yeah, there are a number of communities that have a health component, a health element of their general plan. It's not required by the state, but it makes sense for some communities to do that as well. There is, interestingly enough, the most recent requirement of the state, which I didn't talk about, is something called an environmental justice component, which has to do with the historic issue of city facilities being located in communities of color and low-income communities of color. So, for example, in San Francisco, the Bayview has the city's largest sewage treatment plant, right? And that is an issue that's been endemic in cities across the country, and that whole movement of environmental justice is becoming an important aspect of how we think about these things. And so the state now requires each community to have an environmental justice plan.
Hi. I'm curious about the community character. A little bit more detail about that.
I didn't get around to actually reading your community character element, so I'm not sure I can comment on that other than to say I'm sure it identifies the kind of characteristics and qualities that you're looking for in the communities in the county, but I'm sorry that I can't comment on more than that. Yeah.
I know that San Francisco is looking at the opportunity of taking vacant commercial buildings and turning them into residential.
Yes.
You might have that same situation here in Napa, because we obviously can't expand too much because, as you said, we have agricultural restrictions. So I'd like your opinion on how that would work.
Yeah.
What's the best approach to take?
Sure. We can talk about that more maybe offline, but the city San Francisco has a terrible problem, especially downtown, and right now about half the office space is not being used. And there's been a lot of discussion about conversion. To be frank, if we see 2 buildings, I will be shocked for 2 reasons. One is that many of the older buildings that work better to be converted to housing have not been seismically upgraded. And the cost of doing that is really expensive. In fact, more than one developer has told me that it would make more sense for them to tear the building down and build a new one, which is sad because many of those buildings are significant historic buildings. The other reason is that they required so much more to be upgraded in terms of other building codes. So the idea is great. Everybody loves the idea of converting office buildings, especially into housing. It is proving in California to be particularly challenging to make work.
I was going to ask whether you have a successful blueprint for who should participate in developing a community plan.
Everybody, all of you. No, the issue is not, but literally it should be as many people as possible. But the challenge is often that people who have more time on their hands participate. So I was just talking earlier with some of your colleagues there about how we often had trouble getting younger people involved because they're busy, they have children, they can't be engaged. So there's a lot of kind of, if you want to call it, public participation technology or techniques that we've tried to use over the years to engage more people. For example, in the city's African American neighborhoods, we would go to their church meetings because that's where they often gathered. So we would try to help work with the churches to have meetings in their facilities, not in a city facility, but in their facility, so that we were going to their neighborhood and having a conversation there. you have to think about how you, it's not just the number of people, but how you engage a diverse cross-section of the community. That is really, really important, and it's not easy, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of time. And, but it's ultimately important. Also, using different technology, doing meetings online, doing meetings in person, doing meetings in other forums where people can feel more comfortable. Some people are not comfortable coming to a meeting like this and asking a question. They might do it through email or through social media or through other means. So it's important to use that whole range of techniques to engage people.
Other questions? Okay.
Hi.
Hi, the irony is not lost on me that the state has this requirement for county general plans, and yet there's a massive taffy pull between what the state requires and maybe what is good for a county. And, you know, what are some of your recommendations to help balance out what a state feels, for example, housing requirements, versus what a county really believes is the proper use?
Yeah, there's clearly, I mean, particularly in housing, there's obviously that tension. Obviously that the state believes that we have underbuilt housing. I personally happen to agree with that assessment, that the state has drastically underbuilt housing given the population and job growth over the last 50 years. But it's also a challenge because of, particularly of places like Napa, right, where you are fierce about keeping your agricultural preserve. I don't have an easy answer for you on that, other than to say that these things are always a balance. You have to, I mean, it is important for us to think about where housing, and not just housing, but it's primarily around housing, where housing should be built and how it should be built. Right? It's not just a question of location, but the character, the quality, the density, and all those things are important when you're dealing with these issues. I personally believe, I'll just lay it out with you, that I think the state has generally done the right thing by saying, look, we have to get our act together and build more housing in this state. How they've done it, I have my qualms with some of it. Some of it's been a little rough-handed, I think. But I think it's important, frankly, for everyone to do their part. You know, we've even had that problem in San Francisco where within the county, in the city, the west side of the city has seen virtually no housing in decades. And virtually all the city's housing growth, and at one point we were building 10,000 new units of housing a year, was happening in the east side of the city. And that's now changing, and then the city is looking at changing the zoning to allow higher density housing on some of the commercial streets on the west side of the city. This is an issue every county in the state is facing, and I appreciate you bringing it up. I'm not giving you a very good answer other than to say you have to kind of make a balance on these things, and you have to balance these things out in ways that work for your community.
Okay,
Hi.
Just a question about the pre-process and elaborating a little bit more, because we're sort of in this pre-general plan process phase. And so what, in this moment, can we take advantage of when it comes to, you know, data collection, or, you know, I mean, you've talked a little bit about this in different ways, like the going out and doing the community outreach, that's so important. But if you're to highlight, like, how we can get ahead of our process now.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, every jurisdiction is going to do their own way of doing it, and I'm sure you'll be hearing from the county soon. But as I understand it, they're going to spend the better part of a year kind of doing the data collection, and this is a multi-year process, I believe, right? So, as I understand it, there's going to be a pretty extensive process of data collection. How they will engage with the community on that, I'm sorry, I just don't know at this point, but I can't imagine there wouldn't be some feedback opportunities to look at the data, to test it out, for example, with the community. That's going to be really important to kind of move forward in the plan to gather that data. Other than that, I'm sorry, you know, it's really up to the county how they choose to kind of conduct that process.
Lucky for us, we have Supervisor Cottrell, who might want to say a word about that.
Oh, very good. Thanks, Supervisor, for being here.
First of all, thank you so much. This was really interesting and informative.
Thank you.
You know, I feel like I'm getting familiar with our general plan, and the process that we embark on going forward here is going to be so important. So I appreciate both John and Molly's question about process.
Mm-hmm.
Just to share exactly what you're outlining, The baseline data report will happen over the next year, where data collection will be happening, but we at the board just got an update on it yesterday or Tuesday, where we heard that there'll be lots of workshops and public outreach as part of that process, so that people can offer information that they might have, but also learn about how the data is being collected too. So yeah, so there will be a lot of that public outreach even before kind of the document itself starts to be assembled.
Great, thank you for that.
So a question, since
Please.
I have the mic.
Please.
I love, again, this point about what the substance of the document looks like. And, you know, we, as you can see here, have a very engaged community. And it's really important that we have a process that people feel like they can have their voices being heard in, because that will be as important, I think, as the actual end product. So can you give us any examples of highs or lows that you've seen in other general plan processes?
Well, I mean, I'll just give you a couple of thoughts about sort of techniques that were used. I mean, there's this sort of a newish kind of approach. Maybe some of you in other fields have used this, called scenario planning, where you literally kind of create different scenarios and work with and conduct workshops around these scenarios. So you kind of look at the pros and cons of each scenario and what likely future would result from each of those scenarios. And it's a very interesting way of thinking about how this works, because it isn't about like the transportation element or the open space element. It's about this whole thing as a whole and about the place we want to be. And in this scenario, let's say there's a scenario that had, was heavy on housing and not much else in terms of jobs. What would that scenario look like in 20 or 30 years? And another scenario that was the opposite. I don't know, I'm just making stuff up as I'm standing here, but the idea is that you play out different scenarios that have different combinations of factors and then say, what is this going to look like in 20 years if we do that? To me, we did that with the transportation element of our general plan, and it was a very interesting way to engage the community, because they weren't thinking about the details of policy statements. They were thinking about, well, what is it? If we make these decisions, what's going to happen in 20 years? So that seems to me like an effective way to think about it. And there's different ways of doing it. That's just one technique that I've used.
Do you have any advice on the best way to minimize the impact of politics on the process? Because that's really the concern of some of us in past experience. We've had panels and gatherings and not been able to get as much accomplished as we'd like because of politics.
Yeah, we did a great job. San Francisco is not political at all. Look, politics is always going to be part of this. I think if I may paraphrase your question, I think what you're really saying is, how can our decision making be as least political as possible and be objective and be about good planning and good communities and not about political expediency? If I could paraphrase your question, I think.
We want fair.
Sure, I completely get that. I think the best way to do that is to get the largest amount of community consensus around these issues as you can. Because any elected official, and I know there's several in the room, so bear with me, will feel the weight of that community voice if that community voice is saying one thing and they want to go another way. So to me, it's about getting the most people possible engaged around these key issues. It's not always going to work, and you have to accept that. Politics are always part of this work, I think, but I think there are ways to minimize that sort of influence over time.
Curious to know what you see the role of AI playing in the future of community planning with respect to time saving and
I don't know, I'm a Luddite on this stuff. That's a really good question that I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer, other than to say that it might be helpful in some of the mechanics, but I can't, from what little I know about AI, I would have a hard time imagining that it could actually, well, let me back up. What I was just talking about was scenario planning, looking at these different scenarios and likely outcomes. it might be good to test that out. Actually, now that I sit here and think about it, it might be interesting to see how AI can be helpful in sort of creating the sort of future outcomes of different scenarios. It'd be fun to see how that worked, actually. to see if you agree. I mean, the thing that might be interesting to do is to do an AI-generated version and then have a community discussion to see if there's agreement around it.
Okay, so I think what we'll do is give our big thanks to John. And then John, knowing that that your bio included the fact that you were born and raised in Detroit, this is not what you think it is. This is actually the power window assembly of a '73 Oldsmobile. And,
Wait, I think I had one of those. No.
Yeah, Frog Sleep is very diversified in terms of their production. So thank you again for coming.
Thank you.
If you have a couple other bits for John, he'll hang out a minute. Stay a
Absolutely.
minute, enjoy the wine and cheese. Thank you for coming. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Darren. Appreciate it.